To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith, I pay homage. So we recall the Buddha's teachings through this verse, the essential core teachings of the Buddha. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Then we do a short mandala offering, give ourselves a chance to kind of offer something for these teachings to the holy beings, the Buddhas, all of our gurus, making this vast pure offering so we can receive their blessings and inspiration to actualize these teachings in our own minds for the benefit of all beings. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then finally, refuge in bodhicitta, which, as you know, encompasses these two ideas in the first 2 lines, taking heartfelt refuge, finding safe direction in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, especially the Dharma that we're learning and practicing. And then also cultivating bodhicitta by reciting the last 2 lines, thinking that we're here together, engaging in these teachings so that we can develop ourselves completely to the state of enlightenment and then lead all other beings to attaining that same state. So let's recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, thank you, Heather. Let's do a short meditation then. As we usually do, just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to let go of whatever distractions or preoccupations we might have in our minds. So no doubt you have a technique you already use with the breath. If you need a suggestion, I generally suggest working with the area around the nostrils. It's kind of a nice point to work with, keeps the mind a bit elevated, but we pay attention to that sensation around the area of the nostrils that we feel as we breathe in and out. And just stay present with that as best as you can. And in any meditation, we want to have that factor of introspection, checking in to see the quality of our meditation. And if we check in and see that we've lost the breath, that we're elsewhere, making grocery lists or recalling things from this past week or making plans for the future, whatever it is, then we acknowledge that. We don't have to judge ourselves on the basis of that. Distractions happen in the mind. We let go of that, though, and bring the mind back to the breath. All right, so let's do a few minutes in silence on the breath, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation of bodhicitta. So now let's set our motivation for today. And I'd like to review the other three perfections we've covered so far as a means of generating our motivation, and also to add in some of the thoughts that already move us towards this fourth perfection we'll be discussing today. So first, reflect on the first perfection, generosity, giving. And do this in the light of acknowledging the ways in which you already do give. Give material things, give protection, give the Dharma, even give love, loving kindness to beings. And take a moment to really rejoice in what you already are doing in this life, the things you have done that you continue to do on a daily basis that contribute to your own acts of generosity. And then we move on to the second perfection, ethics or morality. Many of us have already taken vows of abiding by certain types of morality, but there are the core teachings of the Buddha as to what we should refrain from, the actions we should engage in, those more virtuous actions, and even just the behavior of benefiting other beings. That is part of the Bodhisattva's practice of morality. Here too, reflect on your own engagement in ethics in this life and the past, as well as what you are engaging in currently, the vows that you hold, the ways in which you are restraining your behavior and engaging in more virtuous deeds. And just be very happy about that. Rejoice that you have accomplished that. And then reflect on the third perfection that we completed our study of last week, patience. And it's unlikely that each of us have perfected our patience to where we never have any anger arising. But we've all worked very hard at calming the flames of anger in our own minds, especially towards those who harm us or towards the general sufferings that we experience in life, even the patience that we need in our own developing conviction in the Dharma. Here too, reflect on the ways in which you've been able to practice patience in the past and take delight in that. Feel good that you have met with teachings that have helped you to not be so overtaken by this very dangerous afflictive emotion of anger. So having examined each of those perfections in terms of what we already do, what we're engaged in currently, we might ask ourselves, well, what is keeping me from advancing those to an even greater degree? There might be a number of things that come to mind. But this fourth perfection, what we call joyous effort, this enthusiastic perseverance, this is the practice that will take these practices to an even greater degree. Our generosity, our ethics, our patience, even the other perfections we haven't yet studied, our concentration, our wisdom. We need this very enthusiastic mind that takes great delight in practicing virtue, that makes that the center of our lives rather than our worldly affairs. So generate some interest in this mind that we're going to be exploring today and in the next class at least. This mind of joyous effort, this way that we infuse our mind with this unbridled enthusiasm for our practice, becoming totally dedicated to our developing ourselves to the complete degree that we can, acknowledging that each of us has the potential to achieve Buddhahood. It's simply a matter of whether we put the effort into that. And together with this mind that is interested in this idea of this joyful perseverance, we generate the motivation of bodhicitta, setting our sights on that goal of our own full awakening in the state of Buddhahood. So we then can lead all other beings very skillfully to attaining that same state. Good to see you all here this morning. So we are again in this class on transcending our limitations, recognizing that we have these 6 core practices of the Bodhisattva, the 6 perfections or paramitas that are literally kind of going to the other shore, transcending from our ordinary limited view and boundaries to that greater place that is eventually the state of enlightenment. And so all 6 of these are very important. The one that we're going into, as I was explaining in the meditation today, the joyous effort, this 4th perfection, is especially important though. And recall how when we started all these studies back at the beginning of the year that I resumed when I began teaching again in November for TNL, that essentially these are set out in terms of greater difficulty. So the least difficult is the practice of generosity, at least some forms of generosity. We're not saying again that all forms of generosity aren't that difficult, but this is probably an easier practice for most of us to engage in than some of the later ones. Then morality, again, recognizing that we do have to have a pretty strong mind to refrain from negativities, to engage in virtue and benefiting others. And then the last one we studied patience, and you think, well, yeah, patience, that's pretty tough. I mean, we all know in our world we have lots of things that irritate us, people that cause us harm, and so on. And even our own patience, as I said, we have to practice with the Dharma, developing that greater conviction in these teachings. We can see how difficult that is to practice. And you might come to joyous effort and think, well, check out joyous effort doesn't sound like it's that difficult. But I think what we're talking about here and what we'll explore as we go into this in more detail and talk about how we actually engage in this is something that is pretty amazing in terms of when we look at our own lives. And every one of us has an interest in the Dharma. We wouldn't be here in this teaching today if we didn't have some interest or desire to practice the Dharma. But when we look at our lives, nonetheless, we see that we still do have many obstacles to being kind of fully committed. I remember when I was quite young, I don't know, this is maybe not Buddhist appropriate in terms of the concept behind this, but I heard this analogy for whether you're just involved in something or committed. And it's the idea that for breakfast, of course, in the Midwest where I grew up, breakfast was generally like bacon and eggs. So anyway, the idea is that the chicken is involved in breakfast, but the pig is committed. And it's a silly kind of joke, but nonetheless, it does speak to the difference between these two ideas, right? It's something, if you're involved in something, you maybe can give some part of your time, maybe not give yourself entirely, but when you're committed, it's like you give yourself over to that in its entirety. And again, this is not something that is that easy to generate, but we can see beings around us, and certainly in our gurus, they model that type of behavior, right? I mean, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, for example, is amazing in terms of never really having a moment where he just turns everything off, tells everybody just to go away and just, indulges himself, right? He doesn't do that. He's always dedicated to the welfare of others. often doesn't sleep, will always be taking meetings with others, will always be wanting to answer questions, to help others, to teach whenever he can. I mean, even now he's in Kopan, as you know, and giving these amazing teachings that are because he's there in more or less lockdown, and all of us are benefiting from his amazing kindness and compassion. He doesn't stop for a moment and think, oh, well, maybe I should go on vacation while this is going on. Maybe I should go hang out somewhere beautiful on the beach or something. This is, very obvious that he's got that level of dedication. So I'm not, again, this isn't a time for us to be hard on ourselves when we look at this topic, but rather we try to find what I like to call, and I'm basing this on a book by Cheryl Huber, who's a Zen teacher. She calls it compassionate self-discipline. We do need self-discipline on our path, without a doubt. It's hard to turn our minds in the direction of the Dharma. It's hard to practice these perfections. It's hard to engage in all the teachings of the Buddha to the degree that we need to. But with that self-discipline, we need to be compassionate towards ourselves. And of course, some of it comes with an understanding that everything we're doing is for the betterment of ourselves, as well as obviously for the welfare of other beings, because we've got that motivation of bodhicitta. But we are the recipients of our own practice. To the degree that we dedicate ourselves to these teachings, commit fully to these teachings, to the degree that you will benefit from it. In the master's program, there was one student over there. Unfortunately, she passed away about a year or two ago. Libby came out, she was from Israel, and she ordained. Venerable Choki was her name as a nun. And she and I used to joke that, the Buddhas are going to come, dragging us, kicking and screaming into enlightenment. And there is that kind of resistance that we have about moving in the direction of the Dharma. And this is a bit of what we're going to explore today. This is for our own benefit. If we practice the Dharma fully, without a doubt, our own lives will improve, the quality of our minds will improve. We will have all the happiness. Rinpoche often talks about the idea that if we dedicate ourselves fully to the benefit of all beings, all the other happiness is assured. You'll be happy in this life. You'll be happy in your next lives. You'll be happy in terms of attaining your own liberation. You'll attain, of course, the happiness, the bliss of enlightenment. And in that state, be able to lead others to happiness. I mean, it's the total win-win situation. But for some reason, we just have such resistance. We drag our feet. How do we actually get to where we're fully committed to the Dharma? So there are some obstacles, obviously, that we need to examine as part of this discussion. We'll get into that in a moment. But this mind of joyous effort is quite difficult, I think, to practice to the greatest degree. Again, congratulate ourselves on what we have done, even as I went through in the meditation and looked at generosity, ethics or morality, and patience, and asked you to kind of rejoice in your own practice of those. Even rejoice in your own practice of this enthusiastic perseverance in terms of your Dharma practice. That's wonderful that you have developed that to some degree. But recognize there's a lot of work to do to get to that level of full commitment, to get to that level where we are dedicated to the Dharma day in and day out, almost a 24/7 kind of deal. That's what Rinpoche embodies to me, is that 24/7 dedication to the welfare of all beings. That is really how one gets to enlightenment much more quickly and then is able to benefit others much more quickly because of that. So again, these are the ideas that we're going to be throwing around in this part of this class as we examine this fourth perfection. Now, this one has a lot of different names. You'll go to different, this is one of the things about, as most of you have realized from your own practice of Tibetan Buddhism, is because you have different translators, people will translate these terms in different ways. And so you have some people calling this diligence, some people calling this zeal, which zeal is a word we don't use so much, but there's that zealous kind of thing that is a flavor to this. Sometimes it's called perseverance, sometimes joyous perseverance. I'm going to use the words joyous effort generally, though we might use perseverance here or there. And it is important that we incorporate some of this idea of joy. As we're going to see, this is one of the main factors that actually makes this into joyous effort, makes this into this fourth perfection. In fact, I had one teacher who told me once that if you're practicing the Dharma and it's not joyous and fun and happy, then you're doing it the wrong way. So we do want to bring a mind of joy, even when we're engaging in some of the most difficult practices, even when we're having to persevere in the face of great difficulties. So this is the idea behind this. Let's go ahead and I'll start sharing some slides. Certainly, if you did have some questions from last week or the previous perfection, let me know. Put those in the chat box, what have you, and I'll find some time to answer those a little bit later. But I do want to kind of move forward into new material. So again, this fourth perfection is on our list of 6 here. We'll be going on to concentration and wisdom after this, which are two very, very difficult ones. To get the mind fully concentrated to that single-pointed stabilization that we can actually make the mind very powerful, and then to unite that with a wisdom that has deep insight into the nature of reality. These are obviously things that are much greater practices that we hopefully can complete to some degree in this life by attaining some of those. But how are we going to get there? Not without joyous effort, that's for sure. Joyous effort is essential for the practice of all 6 of these. So the perfection of joyous effort, there's a wonderful verse that starts at the beginning of Master Shantideva's text on, as you know, most of you know, you've studied that with Geshe Sherab or with other teachers. The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life includes teachings on all 6 perfections. There are 5 chapters that are dedicated to the 2nd through the 6th perfections. Generosity is taught kind of indirectly. But in the 7th chapter is where he focuses on joyous effort. And he starts off, this is the translation from Lama Zopa's book on the 6 perfections that I've been quoting from, and I will quote from a number of times today. He says, one who practices patience in the above way, what we just studied, should develop fortitude. Here's another translation for this term. For awakening depends on fortitude, because without fortitude, there is no merit, as there is no movement without wind. Just as if you had a sailboat and it was out on the water and there was no wind, the sailboat wouldn't go anywhere. Well, we need that wind, that force that is going to move us in the direction that we want to go in order to attain enlightenment and so on. Awakening, as he said, depends on fortitude, depends on our perseverance and enthusiasm. And then in the very next verse, the first 2 lines, Shantideva says, what is fortitude? It is persevering effort in the cultivation of virtue. Kind of seeing that the path of virtue is what we want to engage in, we will persevere and put great effort into it. Because once more, we see that the results are all good. They're good for ourselves, they're good for others. There's, we have to maybe convince ourselves of that so we can put this type of enthusiasm into our practice. But this is one of the basic reasons why we should be a lot more joyously engaged in our practice. So Rinpoche goes on then to comment on this. He says, at present, we attempt to find happiness in mundane pleasure, and because of that, we are always disappointed. Moreover, in our attempt, we create non-virtue. Here, Shantideva showed us that happiness is the complete opposite of this, that happiness lies in creating virtue, which, Rinpoche is, as I've been saying, this is pointing out this very fundamental truth, that if we are actually concerned about happiness, we should be letting go of our attachment to all the affairs of this life and our preoccupation with them and all the other things that are obstacles, and be engaging wholeheartedly in the Dharma. Again, every one of us has done that to some degree. I'm in no ways wanting to be like, wagging a stick at you and say, you better get to work or whatever. I think we have to find our own way to encourage ourselves to do this. There are sticks and there are carrots. And Rinpoche is kind of pointing out the carrot here, right? That all of our happiness actually lies in that direction. If we want to have happiness, as we say we do, every one of us, all beings want to be happy, well, then we have to create the causes for happiness. We have to be willing to dedicate ourselves to doing that. And as he pointed out, if we continue to stay preoccupied with our worldly affairs, which is actually, we're going to see one of the main obstacles that we have, we're going to only create non-virtue. We're going to create the causes for suffering. Because every time we have a non-virtuous state of mind arising, and most of our preoccupation with worldly activities is the mind of attachment, right? We get very attached to doing this and to doing that, and we fill our day with all kinds of things that we love doing that bring us pleasure. Well, that pleasure is this, as they often say, a honey-coated razor's edge. You've got honey on the razor's edge. It feels very good initially to kind of lick the honey off, but you're licking a sharp razor's edge. You're going to cut yourself in the end. All of that preoccupation we have with worldly affairs is problematic. It ends up wasting our time, but not only wasting our time, it ends up creating non-virtue for most of us. Now, again, we can work with some of our mundane activities with a virtuous mind. Rinpoche encourages us doing that as well. I'll try to emphasize that as we go through this topic. If you have the mind of bodhicitta as your motivation, and you're very clear in that, even in your worldly affairs, even when you're, watching Netflix or having a walk with a friend or whatever the case might be, if you try to maintain good motivation around what you're doing, you can transform those acts to some degree. But think of how much more transformative meditating or reading Dharma or doing other things would be, rather than those worldly activities that we often have so much attachment towards. So we see there are a couple of problems with how we normally live our lives. It wastes this precious human life that we have, that is so valuable. And moreover, it uses this precious life for the creation of non-virtue. So if we create more non-virtue, if we simply hang out with the afflictions for a good part of our day, and then we spend our little 15 minutes on the cushion trying to focus our minds or do whatever with some good motivation, it's just not enough. We have to keep moving the scale. So we might start off our Dharma practice with a lot of worldly stuff and attachment to things over here and a little bit of Dharma, and it has to move over time. We have to get to the point where this is very, very little of our lives. Or when it is there, when we do have our obligations and things that we do with others, seeing family or friends or what have you, we're doing it with such pure motivation and such a good intention that it becomes Dharma practice. That's why Rinpoche encourages us to have this level of what he calls bodhicitta mindfulness, to make all of our activities infused with that. Well, you also don't get to that without joyous effort. Everything requires this perseverance, this enthusiasm that we instill in our lives, that makes even these worldly activities transformed into something very meaningful and powerful. Let's go back. Rinpoche has a little bit more to share with us. He says, when we see this, we will naturally want to do virtuous things, and we will find joy in doing them. When that happens, we will have boundless energy to do more virtuous things. This is enthusiastic or joyous perseverance. This is what we're talking about in this fourth perfection. As Rinpoche says, if we see that this is what leads actually to happiness, then we will dedicate ourselves fully to it, and we'll be so joyfully going about it. And I know, again, many of you do have that joy in your practice. I've seen it in terms of all of you, and the enthusiasm you bring to coming to the teachings and what have you, without a doubt. But there's still probably some areas where we need to inject a little bit more of that, a little bit more of this enthusiasm for the Dharma. Whoops, sorry, went 2 slides. So this is a more, I don't know, kind of not precise definition, but it's a little bit more of a description of what we mean by joyous effort. I've been quoting also, besides Rinpoche's book, from Geshe Loden's Lam Rim book that's published in Australia, wonderful Lam Rim book. He says, joyous effort is a mental factor. It's a factor within our own minds. It manifests obviously in our physical and verbal actions, but it starts with our minds, that takes delight in objects of virtue. And of course, as we've seen with all of these states of mind, when that mental factor of joyous effort is conjoined with our bodhicitta motivation, then that joyous effort becomes a perfection of joyous effort. So we wouldn't call just the joyous effort that somebody has for their engagement in, something that is not together with bodhicitta, where they're really mostly looking at developing happiness for their next life, or even happiness in this life. We wouldn't call that that a perfection of joyous effort. That term is reserved for the practice of joyous effort that's together with bodhicitta. So recall that with each of these two, there was a wonderful set of verses from chapter 5 of Shantideva's text, where he talked about how each of the 6 perfections starts within our own minds and is perfected within our own minds. And here, this is just the single verse that Shantideva uses for this 4th perfection. He says, the result of generating a clear mind is Brahma, and so forth. What that's speaking to is that if we generate a very strong concentration, we can actually take rebirth in these Brahma realms and abodes and what have you. These are things that arise on the basis of our dedicated practice to meditation. But he says results of inferior practice endowed with body and speech are not like that. If we don't have this full dedication, we don't get to those results. we don't have those results. It's interesting that he uses one of these results that's more of a mundane result rather than attaining enlightenment, talking about attaining a state of rebirth. We'll get into the concentrations when we talk about the next perfection, perfection of concentration. But they're essentially, after we develop calm abiding, which is what the teachings on concentration are mostly about, you can go on to develop these 4 concentrations. You can even develop 4 formless absorptions. These are much deeper, more subtle states of meditative stabilization. And when you attain these, you create causes to be reborn in those states. It's what we call unmoving karma. So if you develop the first concentration, then you could take rebirth in the first concentration form realm, which is called the Brahma. I think that's where the Brahma realms are. And then you have the second concentration that causes you to take rebirth in the second concentration form realm. So you have actually a karma you're creating when you develop these meditative states in your human life that cause rebirth in these other existences. So essentially, this is just the example he's using, that if you have this full dedicated practice of concentration that is enthusiastically engaging in making the mind subtler and subtler through generating these deeper levels of meditative concentration, you will get the results from that. Without a doubt, you will be creating the karma to have those results. But if you have an inferior mind without that kind of enthusiastic perseverance, well, then you're not going to have results. Even if you combine that with actions of body and speech, you're still going to end up with inferior results. So he's just pointing out how, once more, it's all contingent on our minds. Yes, we can do lots of things with, physically and verbally, but if we don't have that wholehearted commitment, that enthusiastic perseverance is talking about, that this perfection is alluding to, well, then we won't have the results that we seek. We certainly won't attain enlightenment. There's another verse that I don't have in the slides, but in the context of the 8th chapter, where Master Shantideva is talking about developing meditation, but he's also talking about in that chapter how we need to be free of our own self-centeredness. That is one of the big obstacles to moving along the Bodhisattva path. But he has this verse that essentially says, that if we look at where we are at and what we are doing, I'm paraphrasing here, and the state that we're in, and then we compare ourselves to the Buddhas, who were beings just like us, without a doubt. Every person who's a Buddha, every being who has developed their mind to that state, was exactly like us. Well, what's the difference? The difference is obviously that they dedicated themselves to the work. They said, okay, I'm tired of being in samsara. I'm tired of being unenlightened, being unable to help others to the degree I would like to. I'm going to get to that state without a doubt. I'm going to dedicate myself to this path. That's the only difference, essentially, between the Buddhas and us, is they've made the decision to abandon their self-cherishing, to adopt the 6 perfections, to realize emptiness, to do all the things that are essential to attaining that state. It's really just a simple mental state that needs to be changed. This is really the key. This is why I like teaching on this. We just finished the chapter 7 for the folks in New York and Miami. I was teaching that on Monday evenings for them. And it's such a wonderful chapter to study. If you do get a chance to look at those teachings as part of this course, it would be nice to do that. But the 7th chapter is really a focus on this, the necessity of this mind, that if we are ever to attain any sort of lasting results in our spiritual practice, we have to have this level of perseverance. So let's talk a little bit about, and by the way, you do have a handout. Let me go ahead and share that just so you can take a look at it and know what it looks like. I provided this to Mary last week because I thought I might get into this even last week, last Sunday's class, but know that you can find that out on the Dropbox. And again, you don't need to have a Dropbox account to download from there, I don't believe. I think you just go there and you can click on the types or the mind of joyous effort, and this will have like 4 or 5, I think three pages, I think, for this one. We're going to talk about the types of joyous effort first, then we're going to go on to some of the others. Actually, there are more than 3 pages, I think. I think there's actually 5. Let me scroll down. Yeah, there's 5 pages. So anyway, I'm not going to keep those up on the screen. Rather, I have them in the slides, and we'll go through those. With each of these, I've generally started with the types. Know that in some Lamrim presentations, they don't provide the types of joyous effort until the end of the chapter, for some reason, the end of the section on this. But I think it's useful to get an idea of what these 3 types are about, and have some kind of understanding of what the goal is through what we're looking at in these classes on joyous effort. So The three types are described as armor-like joyous effort. Once more, Shantideva and other teachers often use um, from India use these war analogies, of being having armor. In this case, to protect oneself from any sort of degeneration of practice, we have an armor-like joyous effort. We'll go into that in a moment. Then we have the next two, which are actually very similar to what we saw for ethics. We had the ethics of gathering virtue and the ethics of acting for the welfare of others. This is the joyous effort of doing those things. So it's recognizing that there is an ethical behavior involved in both of those, but this is about bringing that enthusiasm to engaging in that, to actually being dedicated to doing what we can to gather virtue through all the various practices that Rinpoche gives us, that other teachers give us, as well as acting when we can for the benefit of others. So let's go through each of these. This is what's on your handout. There it says, for the sake of relieving the suffering of a single living being. Whoops, I'm sorry. I skipped a slide. That's why I was like, that didn't sound right to me. So this is what's on your slide. It says armor, or the handout. Armor-like joyous effort refers to the armor of a preliminary enthusiastic thought that bodhisattvas put on prior to engaging themselves in any activity. And here the example that's given is this type of mental thought. For 1,000,000,000,000 sets of 3 immeasurably great eons, each composed of days as long as 1,000 great eons, I shall not relinquish my practice of joyous effort. So it's pretty grandiose, this thought of how much time we're going to continue to persevere in our practice. For the sake of relieving the suffering of a single living being, I would happily remain in the hells until I attain Buddhahood. As I exert myself in this manner for the sake of complete enlightenment for all beings, what need is there to mention my joyfully persevering over a shorter period or in the face of lesser suffering? So this is kind of, again, a huge thought that if, for such an incredibly long duration of time, I would remain in the hells, in the worst place of suffering in samsara, until I attain Buddhahood. I would endure all of that. I would joyfully go about engaging in all of that if necessary in order to attain enlightenment. But then, as it says here, as I exert myself in this manner for the sake of complete enlightenment for all beings, not just for one being that I would do that, well, then what need is there to mention my persevering over a much shorter period? Because it's not going to take 1,000,000,000,000 countless great eons, each consisting of days that are da 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 da. I mean, all of what we saw in the previous slide. If it's in the face of even lesser suffering that we have to endure, well, we should be happily engaging in it compared to what that thought was. So we set the thought at an even greater mark than what we even have to accomplish. And then we can happily go about enduring what it is that we are engaged in, so that we can accomplish the goal. So this analogy of the armor-like is once more how we armor or protect ourselves right from the get-go, right from the beginning. Before even engaging in any practice, we think, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have this armor that is going to keep me from succumbing to essentially laziness. We're going to get into, it's the first time I've mentioned that word as part of today's talk, because we're going to get into that being the primary obstacle to our practice of joyous effort. Well, we have to armor ourselves with that thought so that we don't succumb to that force, so that we don't lose our enthusiasm for our practice. So that was a pretty big thought, that was expressed in there. Let's go on and take a look at some additional information that fills in a bit of what this looks like. Rinpoche, in his book, says, perseverance means keeping at it despite the hardships. Guru Shakyamuni Buddha collected merit for 3 countless great eons. So not trillion, but 3 countless great eons. This is what it said is required in order for every one of us to attain enlightenment, is that amount of merit. It's not, again, that duration of time necessarily, but that amount of merit that would be created over that duration of time. We can create it more quickly through practices of Tantra and so on, other practices that we're taught. So he says Guru Shakyamuni Buddha completed that collection of merit before he attained enlightenment. sacrificing himself for other sentient beings by giving away his limbs, his eyes, and even his entire body. Of course, we all know the story of the tigress who was starving, who the Buddha, as the Bodhisattva prince, gave away his entire body to that tigress so that she could then feed her 5 cubs who were starving as well, newborn cubs. So this is the extent to which the Buddha was able to engage in that type of enthusiasm for his practice. For 3 countless great eons, he practiced morality and lived in the pratimoksha and bodhisattva vows, purely practicing patience and perseverance and undergoing great hardships in order to become enlightened and benefit sentient beings such as ourselves. So the Buddha not only engaged in generosity, giving his body and so on, he also, practiced pure morality, living in vows, practicing patience and so on, enduring hardships. Can look at the Buddha as an amazing example for what needs to be done in order to accomplish the goal. As it says in the Guru Puja, the perfection of perseverance means willingly remaining for countless eons in the hottest hell for even one sentient being. This is how the Buddha practiced, without discouragement or depression, and with great joy. So here's the quote from the Guru Puja. Most of you know this. We'll be doing the Guru Puja, by the way, on Thursday for Lama Tsongkhapa Day. Geshe-la will be here to lead us in that. And you'll see this verse as part of the Lam Rim verses. That's verse 104. Even if I must remain for an ocean of eons in the fiery hells of Avicii, that is the hell of unrelenting torment. It is the worst of the hot hells, and they're the worst of the hells. So this is the worst suffering you can endure physically in samsara. For the sake of even just one being to remain there, I seek your blessings to complete the perfection of enthusiasm, that out of compassion untiringly strives for complete enlightenment. So this is this first level of joyous enthusiasm, perseverance, whatever, joyous effort. The idea is that we have to armor ourselves with that type of very powerful thought, which of course means we need to meditate on it frequently. We need to have that force of thinking so that it comes naturally to mind, so that every day we wake up with that kind of determination. And then that will take us not just through this life engaging in Dharma, but it will take us even into future lives. Because if we don't attain enlightenment in this life, we need future lives with that same level of dedication in order to keep moving in that direction. So this is a bit of like the preliminary joyous effort, the thoughts that we need that inform our practice so that we are dedicated to going the whole distance and enduring whatever obstacle or uh, suffering or whatever might arise in order to accomplish the goal. The second and the third, as I said, are extensions of what we had already seen in terms of our practice of ethics, the ethics of gathering virtue and then of benefiting others, helping others. But how it's described here again is it's the joyous effort of gathering virtue is applying yourself to the practice of the 6 perfections in order to accomplish them properly, meaning with great enthusiasm and with joy. Doing these virtuous activities with delight and without hesitation is the practice of the joyous effort of gathering virtue. So again, this is what's on your handout. And this is what Lama Zopa says about it, which I like sharing because Rinpoche always has his own, way of kind of highlighting some things that we can learn from. He says the second type of perseverance is the perseverance of gathering virtue, which means finding joy in practicing the Dharma. As is said in the Compendium of the Perfections, if you have great perseverance, completely free from discouragement, there is nothing that you cannot accomplish or attain. So we can attain all manner of virtue, which of course accumulating virtue, having the collection of our merit of virtue is a really important part of our path. So we need to be fully dedicated to doing that, to engaging in all the virtuous activities, especially those that Rinpoche recommends. I mean, he is always recommending various things to recite, to meditate on, to do as part of our practice of offering and so on. He continues, he says, when we have perseverance to practice the Dharma, our life, whether long or short, becomes highly meaningful, even if we don't live beyond today. If we live today with that type of joyous enthusiasm, how meaningful for that day. How quickly we attain enlightenment depends on how much perseverance we have, because perseverance is the quality that keeps us from the distractions of worldly affairs, from laziness and sleep. which again we'll talk about shortly, because that's the next topic that I want to go into, is how we have these major obstacles to our generating this enthusiasm, which is our laziness, which draws us into uh, procrastination, into our attachment to worldly affairs, even into some level of despondency when we look at the Bodhisattva path and what's entailed in it. So this is what Rinpoche says in regard to that. He then quotes from the Sagaramati Requested Sutra, says, the lazy person has no generosity, and so forth, up to wisdom. None of these perfections. If you're lazy, you don't engage in any of them. You don't even get up off your butt to do any of these. The lazy person cannot benefit others. The lazy person is far from enlightenment. Again, this isn't Rinpoche's way of rubbing our nose in it. And if we acknowledge our own laziness, it's good that we acknowledge that, but not to think that that's something unchangeable. We can move away from that. We can actually move in the direction of joyous perseverance and enthusiasm for our practice. But we do need to acknowledge that if we simply succumb to our laziness, we're not going to get anything done. Nothing is really going to happen. The third of these types of joyous effort, again, this is what's on your handout that is out at the Dropbox. It says the joyous effort of acting for the welfare of others is properly applying yourself to the practice, which means applying with great dedication and joy, no hesitation, as was pointed out with regard to the previous previous division. So you apply yourself to what? To the practice of the 11 activities for others' welfare, which are the same 11 ways of helping others that were taught in the context of the perfection of ethics. There I talked about them briefly. I didn't even go into great detail on them, but this is the chart. Just so you know, that was the slide from when we went through the types of ethics. The third type of ethics was the ethics of acting for the welfare of others. Here's the joyous effort of doing this, means that we joyously and without hesitation engage in these, helping those who suffer, helping those who are ignorant of the methods that lead to happiness and away from suffering, benefiting those in need of help, protecting those in danger, helping those afflicted with misery, helping the poverty-stricken, the homeless, helping others according to their wishes, helping those that are on the right path to continue and generate greater realizations on the right path, helping those on the wrong path to know what the right path is, helping others using miracles, which many of us may not have, maybe all of us, but nonetheless, at some point, if we do have these through the force of our concentration, this is also a benefit that arises from developing deep concentration. We can use emanations and various other things as a way of helping others. Well, if we have those skills and abilities and we don't use them to help others, that would be a real unfortunate thing, because others could definitely benefit from what ways we can, in a more transcendent way, benefit them. So these are the ways that we looked at in ethics, that we engage in the ethics of helping others. And we would want to, again, have that same enthusiasm we've been talking about for doing these now, that when we hear the words, I need help, that's actually like the most joyous thing we could hear. We think, oh, wonderful, I get to help this being. So now Rinpoche says on this, he says, Bodhisattvas work solely for the welfare of others and find incredible joy in doing so. This is the third kind of perseverance. No matter how long it takes, and no matter how little progress we seem to make in helping others, we should never become discouraged. So it is hard to help other beings, Um, the many beings, although they might seem like they need help, might have obstacles to accepting our help. Many people can be very belligerent in the face of helping others. We have to be very skillful in how we do that. In fact, last week, Gary asked me if at times I would talk about this concept of skillful means, or upaya, and I may do that to a larger degree at a later point in this course. But it is hard to have what the Buddha calls skillful means. Skillful means is in the traditional teachings, when we talk about the 6 perfections, when we relate these perfections to the 10 grounds of a bodhisattva, the path that the bodhisattva takes in developing their wisdom to an even greater degree, we actually have 10 perfections. And the other 4 perfections, the very first of them is skillful means. The other ones are prayer, power, and then this form of exalted wisdom that goes beyond the perfection of wisdom. That's actually perfected on the 10th ground. But skillful means is actually said to be an extension of our wisdom. And it's kind of interesting because when we talk about skillful means, we mean that the ability to know what needs to be done and how to do it and how to help others to a greater degree. And that's motivated obviously by our compassion. It's never separated from our compassion. That's why it's a practice of the Bodhisattva, one of the 10 perfections. But nonetheless, it does take some ability to know how best to benefit others. But it starts with the enthusiasm for wanting to do that. And then over time, through our own experience and our own knowledge of the Dharma, we learn how best to benefit others. I mean, this is why it's so amazing that we do have gurus on our path, beings who have dedicated themselves to developing their own ability to know how to help us. And many of you have already found your way of relying on Geshe Sherab or Venerable Rabina, or certainly Lama Zopa Rinpoche, His Holiness, other beings that you might have a connection with, to obtain advice that is in line with what you need to do. So that when you're having a particular challenge in your life and you write to Rinpoche and Rinpoche says, oh, it would be good for you to do this and that, you do it with great joy because you recognize that he's somebody who embodies that skillful means. He's somebody who knows exactly how to benefit others. And by following his advice, we're planting the seeds to be able to do that for others. So there's that other component that I'll try to bring in where I can as we go through these. And as I said, maybe even talk a bit more about it at a later point. But this is an important part of our benefiting others. We can be a bit like a bull in a china shop if we aren't really careful in terms of how we actually benefit others, what it is that we offer in our assistance, how we go about doing that. We don't ever want to compound situations for people or cause them greater suffering. It starts with good intention, but good intention isn't enough in some cases. If we were really dedicated to helping others, we need to know how skillfully to do that. So this is also a part of, the development on this path and part of this third type of joyous effort, as well as our third type of ethics, that we want to be committed to helping others, but actually have that be informed with what it is that we need to do. And of course, we're not going to know that right off the get-go, right? That's one of our problems. Um, Lama Yeshe, in one of his last teachings on bodhicitta, he said and I've shared this quote, I love this quote. Ever since I read it, I think it's one of the most powerful quotes from him. He says, one of the most painful things about our lives is that we can't help others to the degree that we would like to. And we see people around us suffering all the time, and how can we help them? Well, he says bodhicitta is the answer to that. Not to say that we shouldn't try to help in the moment. If there are things that we can do when we see someone who's suffering and we feel skillful in how we might go about doing that, and we're enthused to do that as we're discussing in this perfection, then by all means do that. But recognize also that how we become better capable to help others is moving towards enlightenment, having the mind of bodhicitta. So this is a painful part of our existence, is that we can't help others to that degree. And oftentimes we feel very unqualified to help others. Well, how do you get qualified? You have to become a Buddha to be fully qualified, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't help others. As I said, if you assess it and think there's something that you can do, well, then by all means do that. But try to be as skillful as you can. This skill in means, it's sometimes called, or skillful means, is the idea that we have to have some wisdom component about what we're doing. Otherwise, our compassion is just trying to do whatever and doesn't really know exactly how to go about relieving the suffering of others. So I thought I'd bring that in here in terms of this third type of joyous effort or enthusiasm, because it is an important part of it, is to not just go about trying to fix everything in the world without any awareness of what's going on. We see that that doesn't really result in so much benefit, ends up potentially wasting our time. Yeah, it starts with a good intention. And intention is a good part of our practice, without a doubt. But if we're really going to help others, we have to have more. So anyway, I was going to go on then to, in the next part, to talk about laziness and how that is the main hindrance. But laziness in Buddhist terms is not, as most of you know, it's not just the single idea of just lounging around on the couch doing nothing, procrastinating, putting things off, what have you. There's more dimensions to laziness in Buddhism than that. And so we'll talk about that when we return. But I think since we're almost at the top of the hour, let's go ahead and take our break now. And then when we resume, we can go into that topic. Unless there's a question. Is there a question at this point on anything I've said so far? Maybe you can throw that in real quickly. Anyone? Not seeing any hands up, so but there's another page of people or some additional folks that aren't on my screen at least. Okay. All right. Well, then I have almost 11, like 1 minute too. So let's say 10 minutes after we'll resume. So take 10 minutes or so and refresh yourself and get ready to tackle laziness. Okay. All right. I will see you soon. Okay, good. All right. So before I proceed, then let me just do check in and see if there are any questions on what I've talked about so far with these three types of joyous effort or enthusiasm. Anyone have anything else? No? Okay. So the other question that I'm going to field as we go through this is a question that I think many of us have as practitioners, is that we wonder how to get the joy back in our practice. You might feel like our practice becomes very routine, might even become a little bit dry. We're reciting the words or doing the prostrations or whatever it is that we're doing, but it just doesn't seem like it's got much juice to it. So this is something that'll come up when we talk about the four forces that are conducive to creating this type of joyous enthusiasm for our practice. So we'll get into those a little bit later, and then can open it up and talk about that. And maybe even some of you have things you can share from your own experience. This is obviously something that can happen, but there are some tools we can use to help to address it. And then also, I'm sure, again, some of you may have your own experience around that, because it is hard. We're looking at, a path that is pretty difficult, something that does entail a pretty major shift of our minds and addressing a lot of things in our lives that have obviously been around for a long time. We wouldn't be in the situation that we're in if they hadn't been there for such a long time. So this is what we're pursuing with this whole discussion. So were there any other questions? Um, so these Lama Yeshe, the Lama Yeshe quote that I mentioned, maybe in Big Love. I haven't read Big Love from cover to cover, or two covers to two covers. I don't know if any of you have started delving into Big Love. It's a wonderful, wonderful experience to read it. But I took it on retreat with me and I read some there. And since I got back from retreat, I haven't read another page. Just seems like I get so preoccupied with all the things that I'm doing in terms of my other Dharma preparations for classes and things. So, but it could be in there. I do know that quote about bodhicitta, the quote Mary's referring to, is where he said that one of the most painful things about our lives is we can't help others to the degree that we would like to. This is actually also in the Bodhicitta module of Discovering Buddhism, module 10. It's one of the readings there. It's a whole thing on the can't remember the exact name of the article within the readings, but it's one of them on bodhicitta, and that's where he talks about that. But all right, so if there aren't any other questions, let's go back into laziness. So again, we're going to look at this as being the major hindrance to our practice of joyous effort. As I alluded to before the break, when we talk about the concept of laziness in Buddhism, we're not talking about simply the dragging our feet, the procrastination, the sort of lethargy that we have, indolence, that type of thing that keeps us from getting on the cushion or doing the work that we need to do, or reading Dharma, or whatever it is, going to on a retreat. I mean, we have a lot of things that we can see that manifesting in, and that is one type of laziness. But laziness, moreover, includes all the other patterns that we develop in our lives that keep us from fully engaging in Dharma, which can be two more have been identified, and we'll go into these in more detail. One is our tendency to be preoccupied with all the things we're attached to in this life, engaging in all of these various activities. And then the other one is our feeling that we can't do it. We have, and of course in the Western culture, in Tibetan culture, I don't know if this is quite as prevalent, at least it doesn't seem so from everything I've heard about how His Holiness has reacted to this idea of sort of self-deprecation and what have you. It's obviously from the time of the Buddha, one of these forms of laziness. But we put ourselves down quite a bit in the West. We tend to focus on what's negative, or we're a glass half empty kind of culture, and we look at ourselves and don't think that we have the ability to actually achieve these things. That to attain even just great concentration takes so much effort that we think we can't possibly do it. And that kind of voice in our head, the Buddha says, is actually a form of laziness. Why? Because we can do it. So this is what we're going to be looking at in terms of examining laziness and coming to a deeper understanding of how this force is keeping us from having joyous effort, from having this unbridled enthusiasm for our practice. So to start this off, I want to, share what Geshe Loden has in his book. He says the main obstruction to joyous effort is laziness. And here he gives a definition of this mental factor. It's actually one of the non-virtuous mental factors, the 20 secondary afflictions. Um, so laziness is defined there as a mental factor which, having identified an object offering happiness, does not want to engage in virtue, or though wanting to, is weak in aspiration. So we might even sometimes have the idea, well, I really need to do this. I know I need to do this. I know it's something that will be good for me and for others in terms of my own practice, but I just don't have that depth of aspiration to actually commit to it. But sometimes it's just you don't even want to engage in it. You know that you don't have any real knowledge of the or certitude with regard to virtue leading to happiness, but you simply, those things come up and you just decide, I'd rather chill. I'd rather hang out and not do anything. So laziness, he goes on to say, has the function of causing our joyous effort to decline. It prevents fresh virtue from being produced while allowing virtue that's already accumulated to degenerate. So again, we can go through this study of laziness with that idea of really understanding what is it that causes your own enthusiasm for practice to decline. And maybe even to that question that was raised in the chat box around, finding the need to put the joy back into the practice. Well, sometimes it's those forces that we're going to look at later that put joy into our practice, but sometimes it's the fact that our laziness is weighing things down, is keeping us from actually having this commitment. So we can look at both sides of this, and then we're going to start off by looking at, again, the role that laziness plays in dampening our enthusiasm for our practice. So that was the sort of introduction from Geshe Loden in terms of how he talks about that. These are, again, the three types. These are the words that I've given to them. Sometimes you'll see different words for these. The laziness of procrastination, putting things off. Here we are in the land of manana, right, in New Mexico, and people have that kind of attitude often of, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, I'll do it tomorrow. And tomorrow comes and it's the next tomorrow. You just keep putting another tomorrow on it. Well, you never get around to it. The second is, and maybe I shouldn't be so critical of our state. There's a lot of people who do a lot of wonderful things. Don't get me wrong, but we are in sometimes the land of manana. And I think most of you know that. The laziness of attraction to meaningless activity. This is that second type that is a major obstacle for a lot of people, especially with the busy lives that we have. The third one is the laziness of inadequacy, feeling that we are not capable of achieving this. We're inadequate. We don't have what it takes. And this is just a wrong voice within our heads that needs to be corrected because it's actually a form of laziness, because we can attain that. So let's look at what's on your handout for each of these first. As it is said that yearning acts as the basis for joyous perseverance, aspiration here refers to yearning. The way to develop aspiration is to meditate. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. This is the wrong slide. How did I do this? Okay, somehow I erased something. Let me go pull up the other document. I was preparing these yesterday and I went through them and I thought that I had everything corrected. I'm doing too many PowerPoints these days because I'm doing one for almost every class. It's easy for stuff to creep in. Okay, so it was that second slide that's on the handout. With the laziness of procrastination, you have a willingness to practice Dharma, but a sense that there is no time for it now. So that was just an extra slide that somehow snuck in there. Let me stop the share and go back to the slides then. I'll get that line back up. Okay, so this is going forward to aspiration, which is one of the four forces. So this is what was on that I just read. So again, this is the nature of this. I don't think we need to talk about it a whole lot because we all know this type of laziness. And it's not to say that, again, there aren't times in our lives where perhaps we do need to stop our practice and refresh our batteries, recharge, whatever. The idea is that is a very skillful way of working with it. This becomes unskillful because we end up falling into this land of putting everything off and just, not doing anything that we really need to do. And by virtue of that, we end up, as I said earlier, wasting this life because we don't use the precious time that we have. And this in and of itself is a non-virtuous state of mind. It's hard for us to think about it, but in terms of our spiritual practice, laziness is non-virtue. It is something that is moving in the opposite direction of creating the causes for happiness, and will only create patterns whereby we will continue to suffer because we keep procrastinating. So how do we break out of this? How do we actually have some success in dealing with this? The remedy for procrastination is to reflect on impermanence, particularly that the time of death is uncertain. So let's talk about this a little bit. Most of you, as you've studied in your Lam Rim studies, know about the death awareness meditation. This is way back in the Lam Rim. Right now, we're in the great scope of the Lam Rim, the person of great capability. Way back in the very first level of the Lam Rim, the person of the least capacity, the least capable being, as Rinpoche calls them. We had the teachings on death and impermanence. Prior to that, we had looked at the preciousness of this human life as sort of the preliminary for undertaking the Lam Rim, was recognizing that we do have this very valuable human life and an ability to use it well, to practice the Dharma, to move in the direction of enlightenment, and so on. Well, the very first teaching in the lowest scope, the person of least capacity, is to wake us up to the reality of death. And that's done with the death awareness meditation, which has essentially three main points. I'm just reviewing these for those of you who would like a review, or for those of you who aren't aware of these. The very first one is that we have to get that death is certain, that without a doubt we are going to die. And it might sound kind of silly, because every person you ask on the street, if they're going to die, they'll say, of course I'm going to die. Everybody dies. But are they really living their lives from that vantage point of acknowledging their own mortality? And then secondly, this is the point that's being emphasized here, that is your remedy to this level of procrastination, this form of laziness. You have to get that the time of death is completely uncertain. Even when people are told by doctors, oh, you have so many months to live, some of them live well beyond that. Some of them don't live as long as that. Even when you've been given some sort of a notice of when your death might happen, there's no guarantee that it's going to happen then. It could happen earlier, could happen later. Sometimes, death, obviously for most people, does come as a surprise, even when they are acclimated to this idea that death is certain, that it will happen. The time of death being uncertain is what makes it an important part of our meditation. Because if we get that, if we really understand that any particular day could be our last day, well, then we have to live that day very, very well. We have to use that day very wisely. Otherwise, that's the end of our life. That's it. That's all we will have done. That's everything we've done up to that point. But if we live every day with that awareness, Rinpoche even encourages us to wake up every day thinking, if we wake up, that's great. Rejoice that you woke up. You didn't die in your sleep last night. You've got another day. But think, today I'm going to die. I know that sounds really weird. I'm not. It's not an affirmation. It's not like, okay, I'm going to be wealthy. I'm going to have happiness. It's not something you say to yourself to affirm that. It's something you say to yourself because you need that reminder. You need that reminder that today it's very possible that it could be your last day. And most people that die on any particular day probably had no idea it was going to be their last day. Didn't think that way at all. They were in an accident, or they died of whatever causes, and they still were holding on to the idea that death was not going to come that day. But if you live your life every day thinking that I could die today, at least, if not the thought I will die today, well, then you're going to make that day very meaningful. The third of these main points is, of course, to acknowledge that at the time of death, what will be most important is what we've done to develop ourselves spiritually. Why? Because all the other things that we put attention into, all of our worldly affairs, all the things, the resources we possess and everything, all of our attention to this body, even all of our attention to friends and other people that we're quite close to, all of that we leave behind at death. None of that goes with you. So therefore, we have to put our focus on what we do take with us. What you will take with you is what you've done with your mind during this life. If you've used this mind well and engaged in spiritual practice, then that's what you'll take with you, is all the imprints of that. If all you've done is engaged in non-virtue, well, then that's what goes with you. So with those understandings that death is certain for me, that I don't know when it's going to happen, it could happen today, I can hold the thought it will happen today so that I think this is my last day. I need to use it very, very well. And what I need to do then with that life is pay attention to my spiritual practice, is develop my positive qualities, diminish my negative tendencies. That's the essence of our spiritual practice. So that's what Rinpoche and other teachers, recommend as our antidote to this. This is how we actually break out of our procrastination. And I know it sounds a bit like, it's once more a bit more of a stick than a carrot. And many of us have problems with sticks, with kind of being told, well, if you don't shape up, you're going to suffer from this. Well, this is the reality, is that because death can happen at any time, if we die without having used our minds well and used this life well, we could end up in an unfortunate state, and we could end up with many more obstacles to our practice. So he says, what's said on the handout, to overcome procrastination, you must realize that the greatest benefit to both yourself and others at all stages of your life will be gained from the practice of Dharma. So because we have this life and we can create the causes of happiness with this life, and this life can end at any moment, we therefore need to be dedicated to using every day, every minute of every day, every second of every minute as best as we can to practice the Dharma, to engage wholeheartedly in it. The next type of, I know we're going to have some comments from Rinpoche. That's right, I did throw in a few comments from Rinpoche's book on the Six Perfections. He says, reflecting well on impermanence and death gives us the perseverance we need to withstand any hardship we encounter without fear. If we really recall that this life is impermanent, like a water bubble, as Lama Tsongkhapa says, that death can come at any time, that gives us this perseverance, this joyous enthusiasm for using every day well. And then we can withstand any hardship we encounter without any fear, without any hesitation. We just plow through it with that joyous enthusiasm. While we cling to samsara, we fear so many things, Rinpoche says. But when we deeply understand the impermanence of all things, including our own life, we can overcome the cycle of death and rebirth. It's no longer a thing of fear because we know what it's all about and what we are here to do. And we know that the journey continues beyond this life. So it is important what we do with this life, not just for this life, but for beyond this life, to the next life, to lifetimes after that, to liberation, to enlightenment, to all the goals that we seek. But by our clinging to samsara, we are ending up just kind of wallowing in fear. And this is something we need to address through meditating on impermanence and death. That it is just a part of this whole process, that we are going to have to leave behind this life. But while we have it, we can choose to use it well. So rather than the sort of perseverance that makes us pursue what is meaningless, here, with the courage gained from the reflection on impermanence and death, we have the power and determination to overcome our delusions and only do what is meaningful in our life. So Rinpoche is, kind of contrasting this with the sort of effort or enthusiasm we have for worldly affairs, which is actually going to be the next form of laziness, as we saw earlier. This is not about, putting together a bucket list then of all the things you want to do before you die that are all these worldly activities that don't amount to anything. People have this, right, bucket list that they say, oh, I always wanted to see, the Taj Mahal, and I always wanted to do bungee jumping, and I always wanted to whatever. They put together their little list of all the things they need to do before they die. Well, that's those activities, those things that people engage in. Most of them are going to do it with a non-virtuous mind, with strong attachment and what have you. And they're a waste of our time. They don't really result in anything. We can fill our lives with all sorts of stuff that's meaningless. And if we really get this idea of impermanence and death, we know that that's not the best use of this time while we have it. And that's something, again, each of us has to go through our own process. As I said, it's sort of something that starts off with more engagement in all these activities here and less in the Dharma, and it keeps moving in this direction. If you find it going the other way, you start moving there and then it goes back, well, then we have to really examine what we're doing with the Dharma and our own dedication to this path. And we'll see that as part of these four powers or four forces that we look at later that help us to cultivate this joyous enthusiasm. But this is the whole goal, is to keep us moving in that direction. If we get impermanence and death, then we won't procrastinate. We won't put things off because we don't know if there's a tomorrow. Many people think, well, when I get older, I'm going to go on and do many more retreats and I'll spend more time in meditation and study and what have you. Well, yes, our lives are very busy when we're younger, and many of you have families or other commitments and, in your work and what have you that take up your time. But that procrastination can cost you in the end, because if you die before then, well, then all your plans for a wonderful old age when you could do all of this are up in smoke. It's gone. You have to practice where you are and do what you can right now. And that's the importance of this way of addressing this type of laziness. Let me go on a little bit more and then we'll see what questions there are. Yeah, okay. The second type of laziness, the laziness of attraction to meaningless activity. As Rinpoche was alluding, if we really get this, we won't dedicate ourselves to all of our meaningless stuff. We'll actually make our life quite meaningful. But this form of laziness is where we're quite attracted to and even attached to the activities of psychic existence that are motivated by a mind of non-virtue, such as our own attachment to our worldly affairs, to all the things, the status, what have you. Recall that we have those wonderful ways of talking about our attachment to our worldly affairs that are essentially the 8 worldly dharmas. There's a whole book by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, consolidated teachings that he gave on these 8 worldly dharmas. They're set out in 4 pairs. So we have the 4 that we are really attracted to getting and the 4 that we are attracted to not getting, that we are, desiring to not get. And so they are opposites. The first one has to do with all of our material stuff. We really like to have material goods, wealth, all of that kind of stuff that we surround ourselves with. There's no problems with that stuff itself. The problem is our attachment to that stuff, desiring that, wanting not to be separated from it, which is the opposite, right? Our desire to not have loss, to not lose things, to not have them taken away from us, to not have them diminish in their quality, and so on. So that's the first one. The second way that attachment manifests is our attachment to pleasure, comfort. This is a really hard one for us, right? We like being comfortable. In the West, we've gotten to where we've made things so comfortable for us. The power goes out for an evening and you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? We just like things going our way, having the pleasing things that we want in our lives. We're really quite attached to comfort. And anything that jars that causes us discomfort, we're attached to not receiving that. We don't want that. We desire to be free of that, things that are uncomfortable. This is a phrase that goes around that I've heard from other people as well, is that you don't really grow unless you're outside of your comfort zone. So we have this even incorrect recognition of what discomfort is. We think discomfort is something undesirable, but discomfort may actually be good for us. We looked at that some time ago when my first teaching in November, when we talked about the times we're living in and seeing them through a Buddhist lens, right? That we actually have to see a lot of what we're going through as actually a boon to our practice. And all 4 of these that we're trying to avoid over here can be great boons to our practice if we actually use them that way. But the worldly mind gets attached to having the pleasant one and attached to avoiding the unpleasant one. The third and the fourth have to do with kind of our way of being perceived. And the fourth is our attachment to praise. And of course, the opposite is our attachment to not being blamed or criticized. And then the final one is our attachment to having a good reputation, which is a bigger way of looking at how we're perceived in the world or thought of, and avoiding ill repute. So we have those that are kind of tugging at us all the time in terms of our worldly affairs. And a good share of what we deal with that causes us to have this type of attachment is in this category then of the laziness of meaningless affairs, meaningless activities. We just spend a whole lot of time and energy and attention on trying to procure all 4 of these things to get our material gain, our comfort, praise, good reputation, and to avoid the opposites. And that's just a waste of this life. I'm going to read you what Lama Zopa says in this. I didn't put it in the slides, and I decided before before this class, just shortly before, that I wanted to share it, and I didn't really have time to put it in the slides. This is on page 93 of the 6 Perfections, the new book by Lama Zopa from earlier this year. It says, the next sort of laziness we must overcome is the laziness of being attached to worldly affairs. Laziness in this context is not what we would usually associate with the word. We can enjoy chasing worldly pleasures and work hard in order to have what we want. We can be incredibly busy, but that is considered laziness because it distracts us from our Dharma practice. It is the love of non-virtuous acts and the reluctance to do virtuous ones. So I sometimes call this the laziness of busyness, where we fill our life with so many things that we're just attached to doing. Like, why are we doing all these things? Why do we make our lives so busy? And then we think all of those things that we fill our day with are so much more important than our Dharma practice. We're choosing non-virtue over virtue. We're choosing suffering over happiness, essentially. Now, as I said earlier, it's not that you can do those activities with a virtuous state of mind. You can go to work, and even if you have a job that it requires you to work, 10, 12 hours a day, well, you can do those 10, 12 hours with bodhicitta motivation. You can transform them without a doubt. But most people aren't doing that. We haven't gotten our minds to that level yet where we're infusing everything we do with bodhicitta. So we have to take a hard look at our lives and see to what degree are we attached to our worldly affairs? To what degree are we really getting lost in that and caught up in that and not using this life for the best possible result? So let's look at the remedy for this. The remedy that's on your chart says the remedy for overcoming this laziness of attraction to meaningless activities is to reflect on the disadvantages of negative karma and to focus on developing bodhicitta and other positive motivating factors such as love, compassion, generosity, and wisdom. If we spend our whole life preoccupied with these 8 worldly concerns, 8 worldly dharmas as they're sometimes called, we are going to only create negative karma. They are non-virtuous by their nature because they are in the nature of attachment and desire. And if we don't develop positive qualities, it won't be using this life well. And moreover, it will be having an effect on future lives. It will be having an effect on our path to liberation or enlightenment. We have to use this life to generate more virtue and stop engaging in what only causes non-virtue. Again, these are hard words for us to hear sometimes, but nonetheless, we have to wake up to that reality. So Lama Zopa says, we have energy for whatever we have an interest in. We have no problem working hard at things such as planning our holiday because they are important to us. It is a choice we're making about what we put our attention into, what we put our energy into. And as I was saying earlier, we made the choice when we engage in the worldly dharmas to engage in that, put our energy into that which brings about suffering, which is non-virtuous, rather than putting our energy into that which brings about true happiness, that actually leads to better well-being, again, not just for ourselves, but for others. So whether we have time for practice, Rinpoche says, to do meditation, recite prayers, uh, study Dharma, there would be a ton of things that could be in what's called our practice, is a question of interest, of how important we feel the Dharma is, how much we want to help other sentient beings, how much we understand about impermanence and death, the suffering in the lower realms, and so forth. If we really feel that the Dharma is important, that all of these teachings that we're getting on the Lam Rim are essential and are absolutely what we want to dedicate ourselves to, then we make the choice right by virtue of that, and we dedicate our time to doing that. It's just a matter of priorities. So essentially, this is what the advice is for overcoming this type of laziness: is reset your priorities. And of course, that may mean that we have to fall back in love with the Dharma to some degree. We have to put our minds back into, because I have seen this, and this is something that we're going to see even in this third type of laziness coming up, where we feel somewhat despondent, inadequate in terms of achieving the results. A lot of people come to the Dharma initially with great enthusiasm. I mean, I remember at least on a couple of times, people who walked into Thupten Norberling's stores, as all of us did at one point, and came into contact with these teachings. I mean, I remember one student in particular who was like so enthusiastic that he ended up like ordering like 10 books or something. He wanted like all these books. And I was kind of looking at him and going, "Are you sure you want all these? Are you sure you want all these?" And he came back, I think, and took the books, and he never showed up again. It's like you can have this unbridled enthusiasm at the beginning, but it can fall away really quickly. And if you don't maintain your love for the Dharma, you're kind of putting the Dharma as the most important thing, which of course comes about through a lot of this other practice. It becomes a bit of a catch-22. Well, I don't have the enthusiasm for practice because I haven't put the effort into actually generating some commitment to the Dharma and some, holding the Dharma as important. Well, it is a little circular. But nonetheless, it means that we do have to continually fall back in love with the Dharma to some degree. I'm using that term. I don't mean all the connotations that falling in love has, which is mostly about attachment. We don't want to have attachment to the Dharma. We want to see the Dharma as incredibly precious, as incredibly important. And if we don't elevate it to that degree, then all our meaningless activities are going to still take precedence. They're going to actually drive our lives. And we're going to end up spending so many years of our lives preoccupied with all of that, whereas we should have been preoccupied with all of this, especially within the understanding we saw previously that this life can come to an end at any point. And will we have used it well if all we've done is these meaningless activities? So there are a lot of things to think about in regard to this, but the biggest one is recognizing that this is a choice. Every one of us has that choice every day. How are we going to spend our day? And you might think, well, I don't have a choice. I have people who rely upon me and all these things to do. You still do have some level of choice about how you are going to prioritize the Dharma within your own life and bring that Dharma to life in terms of whatever you're doing. As I said, Rinpoche has this strong emphasis on cultivating bodhicitta motivation, so that whether you're involved in caring for children, or going to your job, or just getting on the road and driving, whatever it is you're doing, you can infuse all of those activities with great meaning by dedicating them to the welfare of others and holding those thoughts. But again, most people aren't living with that level of awareness. It really takes a lot to train our minds to have that recollection, that mindfulness, to be able to infuse our worldly activities with that degree of meaning. So let's talk about the last one, and then I'll open it up for some questions. I think there may be some in the chat box. I'm not sure. I haven't had time to look. So laziness of inadequacy. How it's described on your chart, it says delusions of incapacity make up this third type of laziness. It is believing that you are not capable of attaining enlightenment or engaging in the practices that lead to enlightenment, or even, as Master Shantideva points out, enduring whatever suffering we have to endure on the path to achieving that. So there can be three things that we might have some delusions of incapacity about. The two that are mentioned here: the goal itself, thinking that this goal is just way beyond my capability. I can't possibly become a Buddha. Or looking at the practices that are entailed, some of which we've been talking about in this course, and looking at it and going, I can't get to that degree where I'm practicing at that level, where I'm willing to give up my body to a being to perfect my generosity, where I'm willing to do all these other things, that will help me to progress on the path to enlightenment. We can have that kind of feelings of inadequacy or despondency around the practices. But there's a third one that Master Shantideva puts that I could have added in here, but I don't know why I didn't. Anyway, I apologize, which is essentially all our feeling that we have to endure all kinds of suffering in order to accomplish the path to enlightenment. And there's kind of an answer to that one too. I'll get into that in a moment. But these are the things that often are driving our feelings of inadequacy. The remedy for this type of laziness is that you must gird your mind with strong and positive views and eliminate all limiting misconceptions. You have to really meditate on these things, come to understand that the Dharma is pointing to the fact that you have that potential. As it says here, like you, all the Buddhas of the past were once deluded, but were able to apply effort and subsequently attain their goal. I mentioned that earlier, right? That verse from Master Shantideva from the 8th chapter. In fact, I can pull it up here right now so I can recite it to you. But the idea behind it is that, again, we have to recognize that we and ourselves and the Buddhas, the only difference is that they put all the effort into achieving the goal. It's verse 130 from chapter 8. It says, is there need for lengthy explanation? Childish beings look out for themselves, get all attached in all their own worldly stuff and what have you, self-centered. Buddhas labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them. The difference that divides them, you just have, if you dedicate yourself wholeheartedly to achieving the welfare of others, to practicing this path through this type of joyous enthusiasm, you'll attain Buddhahood. I had one teacher say that even if you, have some reluctance to attaining Buddhahood, if you put all the causes and conditions into place, you're going to become a Buddha without a doubt. Buddhahood is the natural result that follows, that ensues from our dedicating ourselves in this way. If we create the causes, without a doubt, the result will occur. But we have to, address this despondency that thinks that somehow we aren't capable of achieving that. As was said in that last bit of the passage that was on the slide, we all have Buddha nature. We all have the potential to achieve this. Therefore, since you have that, you can do the same. So I think it is important we just take a minute or two to talk about Buddha nature. Many of you have come to teachings that I've given on Buddha nature in the basic program. The text that's studied there, the Maitreya's Uttara Tantra, where it goes into great detail about Buddha nature and gives all these wonderful examples. But essentially, Buddha nature has kind of two elements to it. One is the one that we often talk about, which is the developmental Buddha nature. The fact that our minds right now, in the state that they're at, just like Buddhas of the past were in our same state, are deluded, clouded with delusions, overcome with delusions. But those delusions are not in the nature of the mind. They're adventitious. They're there because we simply haven't created an antidote towards them. All of the Buddhist path is about developing antidotes to those negative states of mind and enhancing the positive states of mind that are often the counterparts to those. So we all can transform our minds. The mind is not fixed, it's not stationary, it's not something that is cast in stone. Rather, all of those things that are clouding and obscuring our minds currently can be absolutely removed, and the pure nature of the mind can be known. Now, the deeper level of Buddha nature is why that's possible, which is the emptiness of the mind. I've brought in emptiness here and there as a topic that is already introduced in some of these earlier perfections, even though we won't get into it in depth until the sixth perfection. But emptiness of the mind means that the mind is not inherently existent. It doesn't exist intrinsically, substantially. It therefore is changeable. The lack of inherent existence is what makes the mind capable of changing. It's the sort of foundation upon which all of that can occur. As Nagarjuna said in his fundamental wisdom, fundamental treatise on the middle way, called wisdom is the full name for that. He said, for that person for whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For that person to whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible. The only reason why things can change and develop, why your mind can become a Buddha, is because it's empty of inherent existence. And you can therefore develop your mind through the developmental Buddha nature, taking it from the current deluded state that it's in all the way to the purified state of complete enlightenment. So you have Buddha nature, every one of us has Buddha nature. It doesn't mean you're already a Buddha. It means you have the potential to develop into a Buddha because your mind is fundamentally pure on a conventional level, because everything that clouds it is only there adventitiously. And it's fundamentally pure in terms of its ultimate nature. It doesn't have a single stain of inherent existence. It doesn't exist on its own in a sort of concretized way. So this is the thing that we need to reflect on to counteract this despondency to some degree, is to recognize that we all have the potential to do this, that every one of us can achieve that goal. We can endure whatever practices might need to be um, uh, gone through in order to achieve that state. And actually, it's kind of interesting. They do say, and I'll read a little verse from Master Shantideva on this too, that when you wholly commit yourself to this, it's not like you engage in more and more suffering. The causes of suffering become less and less and less over time. And the joy you have on your path actually becomes more and more and more. In that same chapter that's on what's called here diligence, joyous effort, enthusiasm, the perfection that we're working with, verse 30 of chapter 7, Shantideva says, mounted on the horse of bodhicitta, which puts to flight all mournful weariness, what lucid person could be in despair, proceeding in this way from joy to joy? Essentially, when you get fully committed to the path, joyfulness just becomes a part of the path. You actually see all of that opening up rather than more and more suffering. Yes, it does take concerted effort and does involve some determination to move in that direction. So there is some suffering we have to endure. But once the happiness of the Dharma starts to unfold, it becomes its own sort of propelling factor, keeping us going from joy to joy. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I may have mentioned this quote before. It was in teachings that I received from him in 2004, right at the end of the master's program, when he came to Italy for a 4-week retreat. And I was kind of a bad student. I didn't go to all of the retreat, I have to admit. Well, first of all, I arrived when the retreat was already underway. And so I had some jet lag to deal with going to Italy from here. And it took me a while to just get on a regular schedule. But one of the teachings I had the good fortune to attend, Lama Zopa made this statement, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he says, we must learn to let go of the pleasure that leads to suffering and gladly adopt the suffering that leads to happiness or true pleasure. The idea behind this is that so much of what we get caught up in is the pleasure that only, it's like that, honey-coated razor blade, right? It is what causes us to eventually suffer because we are so attached to it and just keep yearning for it and desiring it that we end up creating these unhealthy patterns. That's the pleasure that we need to abandon and see that it really leads to just suffering. Whereas we need to adopt some and embrace some level of suffering. And by suffering, he means the discomfort of getting out of our, attachment to worldly affairs, our despondency, our laziness of procrastination, all these things, and moving towards that which is true happiness. If we are willing to invest in that level of discomfort or suffering or difficulty, we're going to see the causes of happiness unfold for us in unbelievable ways. This is, again, the whole theme that we've been seeing throughout today, is that all of what we're talking about with joyous effort is to engage in what will actually bring about your happiness and the happiness of others, as opposed to, more suffering for yourself and no ability to really help others to benefit them. So this is the same sort of antidote that we need to this level of despondency that we might have with regard to the goal itself, enlightenment. Well, Buddha nature says you can attain enlightenment. You just have to achieve the causes that lead there. You have to address the negative tendencies and the delusions that are clouding your mind and advance the positive qualities, and you'll get there. That's what the state of Buddhahood means. That word, that wonderful word that Venerable Rabina often comments on, that we just said in the refuge formula that we recited at the beginning of class, Sangye. Sang means to completely purify, remove everything that is negative. Gye means to fully develop. Well, every one of us has the potential to achieve that. By virtue of having a mind, you have Buddha nature. You have the potential to do that level of purification and development of your positive qualities. We might have despondency about all the things that we need to practice on the path that are just seem so overwhelming and difficult. Well, you do them one at a time. You just engage in things as you can, but keep moving it forward. Nobody ever, I mean, I do hear this sometimes from some teachers that they say, we can achieve enlightenment kind of instantly, this instant enlightenment or something. Well, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they say if you do it that quickly, well, you must have done a whole lot of work prior to that, in prior lives, because you do need that level of work in order to be able to cross the threshold into enlightenment. But just as a bucket of water is filled up drop by drop, eventually you're going to fill it up to its entirety. It'll get to the rim, eventually, and you will have the entire thing. But it only is a matter of putting your mind to what you can accomplish now, and then what you can accomplish next, and then what you can accomplish after that. We don't have to do these outrageous things like giving our body to another being so they can, like the tigress eating the prince's body, the Bodhisattva prince's body. We don't have to do that at this stage of our development. We give where we can, and we want to push it further. That's what this whole course is about, right? Transcending our limitations, looking beyond where we're at to see how we can keep advancing in that direction. Well, that right there says that we don't have to be kind of overwhelmed by the degree to which we have to engage in outrageous practices right now, because we just engage in what we can right now and keep moving forward. And then this third one about having some despondency or feelings of inadequacy around the suffering we might have to experience. Well, in Master Shantideva's text, he says, well, guess what? Yes, there's some initial suffering you have to endure. As Rinpoche says, there is that suffering we have to adopt that will lead to happiness. But it's nothing that's going to, keep going on. We're going to actually find we're on that mount of bodhicitta that will lead us from joy to joy, lead us from happiness to happiness. So I realized, God, we almost talked to the top of the hour here. Let me just share the last little bit of what Rinpoche says on this. He says, of course, it is difficult to change bad habits. Our entire life and for countless lives before we have been under the control of attachment. We cannot expect that to drastically change in a few weeks or months or even years. We should therefore not feel discouraged when we fail to see any progress after some time. Such discouragement could make us give up. We might think that the Dharma doesn't work and return to our old life and our old problems. So if we're feeling that discouragement, it can be a huge obstacle for us. They actually say this is the worst form of laziness. If we have this, it's such an obstacle to our practice because we give up so easily. We just don't think we have what it takes. So Rinpoche then goes on to say, we can only purify our negativities and create merit little by little, drop by drop, just as I was talking about. When we see this, we can develop the determination to persevere no matter how hard it is. Then, whether we are up or down, we see the importance of perseverance because it keeps moving us in the direction of accumulating the causes for enlightenment. So, that's as far as we're able to get today, but we will be looking at these four forces that we can use, and we will address this whole issue of those of you who've been around the Dharma for a while, who maybe feel like you go through periods where it just sort of doesn't have the oomph, doesn't have that kind of joy that you would like it to have. How do we recultivate that? So let's take a look and see if there are any questions. We've got, doesn't bodhicitta by definition imply some form of divine attachment to the desire to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of sentient beings? Is all desire contaminated? I think what you're referring to, Larry, there is the attachment that, or desire that becomes a part of the tantric path. As part of the tantric path, it's not that we're cultivating the attachment or desire in and of itself as a sort of state of mind that is an affliction. Rather, we're using the energy of desire. This maybe goes beyond what we can talk about today, in part because the tantric practices obviously are something reserved for those who have initiation and what have you. But we are taking the energy of the delusions and not just desire. It's actually said that you can use the energy of anger, because there's an energy that comes with those delusions that kind of moves the mind in a particular direction. And we can harness that energy in Tantra and use it on the path. But that's how we use it. We don't use it as a delusion, because as a delusion, and the goal is to defeat the delusions. Even in Tantra, the goal is to get rid of your delusions and your obstacles in your mind. You know, it's never to embrace them and grow them and develop them. It's rather to harness the energy of those. And we do see that that is a very powerful force in our lives, right? That's what keeps us in this kind of, for attachment, the sort of junkie mode of always kind of moving in the direction of what attracts us and so on. Well, let's use that energy in a positive way. And again, it maybe goes beyond the scope of what we can talk about today to get into the details of doing that. But if you're curious, you might read Lama Yeshe's wonderful book, Introduction to Tantra, where he talks about this in a kind of very tasty way. And if I had it right in front of me, I might read you a passage or two. But this is, again, kind of producing some difference here between what we normally would talk about as our delusion of desire or anger or what have you, and how those can be harnessed in terms of the energy that's behind them in Tantra. So we always have to practice, of course, where we are and recognize that Tantra is not built on its own foundation. It's built on the foundation of all the work we do prior to that, the Lam Rim teachings and so on. So we first have to learn to work with our delusions, to diminish them, to not have them be so overpowering in our lives. And then when we get to the Tantric path, we can learn how to still have some, capturing of that energy so that we can use it as a powerful force for personal transformation, which is how it's taught in Tantra. So I think that's what you're getting at with that question, Larry, but let me know if I didn't address that correctly. Was there anything else? I don't see anything. Does anyone else have a oh, I'm sorry, but maybe what Larry was talking about too, because I know that I reread it, is that even in the definition of bodhicitta, we do have this idea of it being a desire or an aspiration, but that's a more wholesome state of mind. That's not an afflicted desire at all. When we say, I desire to become a Buddha, well, that's not the desire that is desiring, ice cream or, whatever, worldly pleasures. Here, when we use the term desire or aspiration, we are meaning the movement towards a more virtuous, positive goal, which would be the desire for enlightenment. So I'm sorry, that may be how you wanted. So I did all my Tantra spiel for nothing, but anyway, hopefully you benefited from that as well. So again, if you do have any desire to desire, there I use the word, to pursue the information on Tantra. Lama Yeshe's book is a wonderful way to pursue that. But know that when we use the term aspiration or desire in bodhicitta, we don't mean any form of delusion. We mean a very clear intention to move in that more positive direction towards the goal of enlightenment. So, all right. Yes, you may make an announcement, Mary. I think we're done. Were there any other questions before Mary makes an announcement? I don't see any other hands up or anything. So, okay. So, all right. Mary, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to mention, thank you so much, Gen Don, for the class today. And Gen Don mentioned this earlier, but on Thursday's Lama Tsong Kappa Day, as Gen Don said, Geshe-la will be doing a Lama Tsong Kappa Guru Puja at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you can join us, that would be wonderful. And also on our website, on the event webpage, there's additional practices you can do as individuals. So anyway, have a beautiful day, everyone. Thank you, Gen Don.
Yeah, sorry I got that wrong. I thought he was doing Guru Puja for some reason. That was my own wires crossed. Because it is a Puja day. It is a Sok day. So some of us will have to do Sok elsewhere, I guess. So,
Oh, it is Guru Puja.
oh,
It's just
okay.
he's doing a Lama day on that day of Guru Puja.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you said Lama Tsong Kappa Guru Yoga. And then I get, anyway, signals crossed. All right, so we're clear. Lama's Geshe-la will be doing the Lama Chopa, the Guru Puja, which is a wonderful practice that is kind of creating that energy with our gurus on that special day that commemorates Lama Tsongkhapa. So great. Okay, wonderful. No, it's the confusion's on my part too, so no worries. All right, let's go ahead and do our prayers then. Make sure that all this wonderful energy we've created, our enthusiasm for looking at this topic doesn't get wasted. So if Heather could put those up on the screen, great. And let's do the prayers for dedicating for the welfare of all beings. You might bring to mind those beings that you're specifically dedicating for, that you've added to the prayer list or that you have in your own thoughts, people you've offered to pray for or who've asked you to pray for them, as well as any other beings whose situation moves us at this time. And think about all of them, especially receiving the benefit of what we've done today in terms of alleviating their suffering, bringing them to all the perfect causes of happiness. But also we can think about extending this to all beings, as these words indicate in Master Shantideva's prayer. That is one of His Holiness's favorites. So as we recite this, think that all beings are benefiting from what we've done here today. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And then recognizing the preciousness of our teachers and how we want to create the causes from our side for them to continue to be in this world and to benefit us and others. We'll recite these three long life prayers, and then think also that we're creating the causes by virtue of these prayers for the good health and long lives of all spiritual guides, so that all beings can have perfect guides in every lifetime. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Osahita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Wonderful. Thank you, Heather, for your hosting today, Mary, for all your support, and all of you for being here and taking part in these teachings. I'm really delighted to be spending this time with you, sharing this topic. So if you can, try to meditate on this over the next week. Try to bring to mind these types of laziness and see how they're operative in your own life. Seeing them clearly as hindrances is the first part of our practice so that we then can try to overcome them. So try to do your own meditation on those if possible. Wonderful, everyone. Have a good week. I'll see some of you during the week and otherwise next Sunday. So stay safe.